Welcome to Cal Poly Pomona's URP 3350 class entitled Plan Making History and Future. Today's presentation is going to be on the book Urban Land Use Planning by Berke, Godschalk, Kaiser, and Rodriguez. Today's presentation focuses on Chapter 1, which is called Framing the Land Use Planning Process. My name is Professor Scott Reimers. So this chapter is going to be broken down into a few key sections. The first is Land Use Planning Arena. And there we're going to learn about how messy the planning world can be and that it does require for flexibility. And then we'll introduce the author's idea of game theory and that planning can be seen through the eyes of game theory. Then we'll move on to talk about the different types of communities that are out there. There's some conventional low density development communities. There's communities that are based on sustainable development patterns. Then there's smart growth and the new urbanism communities. And then we'll go and talk about some different values that people bring to land use, and those are generally framed in 4 different categories: economic development, environmental protection, equity, and livability. And then lastly, we'll talk about land use planning programs, and in that we'll talk about what are those support systems that go into land use planning, what different types of plans come together to create a network of plans, and then we'll talk about the importance of monitoring. And lastly, we'll talk about what are the key capabilities you need to be a successful planner. So the authors introduced this chapter by talking about the idea of frameworks. And each of us comes into life and approaches life with a different framework on which our ideas and values are built. An optimist runs into a problem, and the optimist might see this as just a temporary setback. They might see it as a challenge that's going to build them into a stronger person. They might see it as a way of coming up with new strengths and abilities. A pessimist is going to face those setbacks and think that this is the beginning of a long downhill slide. They might, run for cover. They might pull back and withdraw. But they're going to see it completely differently because they have a different framework for dealing with setbacks. And in life, we have a lot of different frameworks, and which gives us all unique worldview. Religion can impact our frameworks, politics, capitalism versus Marxism, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, how you approach life is going to affect how you see the world and see things. And so we're going to find out through this chapter that the authors see planning as a game. And that framework that they approach with through this chapter is going to lead us into 3 main tasks. And those main tasks are to first identify the goals and values in your community, then to integrate information from that community into planning systems. And then lastly, once you've developed those systems and developed those plans, then you need to monitor and evaluate the progress that's being made. So now let's talk about the first section of the chapter, which is the land use planning arena. So this process in land use planning is messy. And as much as we want it to be systematic sometimes, and we want it to follow a set path, and the inner engineer within us wants us to not stray, we all need to be comfortable with the fact that this is a messy process. Sometimes you maybe come downhearted in the land use planning process when you realize that we've developed all these theories and we've developed all of these tools, and sometimes they seem unimportant to the politicians. And the politicians, in the end, are just counting votes. So we need to realize that the land use planning process is a turbulent process. That means it's constantly changing and churning, and we need a framework on which to build that process that can take all these inputs as they change. When working on the general plan in Pasadena, we started the process at a time when the city had been through a long period of growth, and the physical environment had changed dramatically. Streets that had very little buildings on them ended up having some large mixed-use projects on them. And as we started the general plan process, we were getting pushed to focus more on historic preservation and kind of managing change. And then as the process developed and as time went on, we entered a recession. And then there was a much stronger push to continue to grow and to see room for economic development. And so the process had to change as those different inputs changed. The authors offer a flexible framework for understanding the land use process and what they term game theory. And what they say in this book is that planning is a high stakes game. There's a lot going on, and it's going to mean some benefits for others and cost for others. But it is high stakes in that it has a lot of impact on the environment, it has impacts on social equity, it has an impact on people's economy and on their jobs. So as we have a high stakes game like this, it's very important for us as planners to try and create consensus through the process. And that's really the purpose of the land use plan, is that it helps coordinate a community. As there are many competitors in the process, our goal as planners is to change those competitors into collaborators. So this land use plan is a series really of agreements that the community has developed over time, given the different inputs. Often one thing that can help a community is to create that sense of collaboration and unity is a graphic that tells a story. When we worked on the Crossroads specific plan in Temple City, we used a series of graphics to find out what people wanted. It was easier for people to circle pictures or put post-it notes next to pictures that they really liked. And those pictures we ended up using throughout the process to help underline the sense of unity that had been developed through the process. Your role as a planner is as a game manager, and that means it's your job to advocate for cooperation. That means you're trying to get all these different competitors to cooperate. You're trying to take all these different inputs that you're hearing and pull together a vision. And you're also creating the rules. Now, yes, the city council in the end is the final arbitrator of the rules, but it's the planner's job to set out a series of rules that work for the community to create that sense of collaboration. So now that we've talked about that land use planning arena and how messy and unsystematic it can seem at times, let's turn our attention now to values, planning, and sustainable communities. The authors provide this figure 1.1 in the book, in order to diagram what the process is like, the planning process is like. In this central portion of the box, we have planning support systems. And this is the first part of our land use planning process. So in the first part of the land use planning process, we're going to collect information about the population, about the economy, how many jobs are in the community. We're going to look at the environment and we're going to see, are there any concerns that we need to think about in terms of endangered species? What is the air quality like? Do we have certain air quality goals that we need to meet? Where are there noise issues? What are we doing in terms of greenhouse gas emissions? In terms of land use, you'll go through and you'll collect information about how much development there is in the community. You'll go out and find out what the uses are of everything in the community, what land uses are out there. Transportation, you'll put together a report on how long it maybe takes to travel from one end of the community to another, or where you have poor level of service, or where there's congestion. And then that generally results in a community report. In Pasadena's general plan, we called it an outreach summary report. And then we also created a separate metrics report, where in the metrics report, we put together a lot of information since the last general plan update about how the city had grown and developed. Now, prior to getting to that step, there are a lot of other things kind of circling around the process in the community. And those are a lot of different values. And these values, as I mentioned before, change over time. People's concerns in terms of the environment change, where we used to not think too much about greenhouse gas emissions. Now that's on everybody's mind. Where we used to be concerned about CO2 hotspots, now people are not as much concerned about congestion, and they're more interested in reducing greenhouse gas emissions by putting development together in a small node. Equity has been an increasing thing on everyone's mind since the pandemic. The economy changes cyclically, so where a community might be saying there's been too much growth one year, a few years later might be saying we need to spur more growth because we need more jobs in this community. And then issues of livability. Are we preserving a community? Um, are we creating a beautiful community that people want to live in? Is there enough open space in that community? So these are kind of circling and creating inputs throughout the process. The next box, box number 3, is the network of plans. A community might have one of these plans. They might have multiples of these plans. So there's what's called an area-wide policy plan. There's a community-wide design plan, perhaps. There might be a small area plan or a development management plan. Typically in California communities, we see what's called a general plan or a comprehensive plan. In some communities, they might then have smaller plans. City of LA has community plans. Other cities might just have a specific plan for those communities. And then, yeah, I think that's it. And then lastly, all of that then comes into, hopefully, the vision that's created then as a sustainable community plan, where things are balanced well in terms of the environment, equity, economy, and livability. Now, throughout that process, there's kind of an underlying need to monitor, evaluate, and update. So throughout the process, you're monitoring whether things in the planning support systems are changing. You're evaluating whether your plans are working or not. And if they're not, you're updating those plans. So then after talking about that land use process and all the different inputs that are going into it, the authors then focus on that last portion, that kind of the vision portion of what your land use plan is moving towards. And they offer that land use plan should be moving towards more sustainable communities. Kind of in opposition to that, they seem to develop that conventional low density development is the opposite of sustainable communities. Now, it's important to know where this idea of low density development came from. Much of it came from a backlash over high density, poor housing in the downtowns of Chicago and New York, where people were living in awful conditions. And so the thought of moving out to lower density areas where there were less issues, pollution and such, became very attractive. And so after World War II, the United States was also going through a huge boom in population. After World War II, soldiers were coming home, starting families. And so the easiest way to develop and the fastest way to develop is by doing some low density development. So people were moving out of the downtowns and into new suburbs. These suburbs often involved highways, strip malls, detached single housing units. And some of the values surrounding that was there was a value for detached single family housing. Home ownership was a strong value. Having a spacious lot with a rural feel. Having your own private automobile rather than taking public transit, and having a community free of poverty were the values that that development pattern was based on. But there were some downsides to that, and that conventional low density development eats up a lot of land when you have people living on large lots on large houses, or large houses on large lots. And then that use of land can have major environmental impacts, as we've seen. It creates more driving, which creates more air pollution and more greenhouse gas emissions. Infrastructure also becomes very expensive in that type of development because you're having to take infrastructure and spread it out further. It creates higher auto dependence, which can create a greater sense of loneliness from a social impact. But also creates higher greenhouse gas emissions. It can also exacerbate inequality as people leave the central business district, and it can create health concerns tied to a lack of activity. If you're spending all day driving from work to home, that can create obesity. Sprawl tends to lead to less activity and more obesity and hypertension. So in opposition to that conventional low density style of development is sustainable development. And this graphic doesn't show it exactly right, but the common way of thinking about that as a stool held up by three legs. And the three legs of sustainability are economic sustainability, social sustainability, and environmental sustainability. And it's important to make sure that each of those legs is strong and approximately the same length, because you don't want to create a plan that's only focused on environmental sustainability and leaving out jobs for people, or creating a system that's not economically feasible, or leaving out social equity issues. Leaving half of the population behind is not beneficial. So the idea of sustainability is that what you're producing and what you're consuming and that physical environment can all be built without degrading the environment. And it also needs to include maybe a fourth leg of that stool, which would be livability. And that is a place that people want to live, that there's open space for people to recreate in, that there's all of those things that bring in quality of life. Are there art museums? Are there places for entertainment? Are you preserving your history? There's that social leg is really bringing in that sense of intergenerational equity as well, that we're not just being fair to those who exist today, but we're also thinking about future generations. There are potentially 6 principles to long-range sustainable development, and that includes harmony with nature, a livable built environment, a place-based economy. That means you're building an economy based on the unique aspects of that place. So you're not bringing in inputs from hundreds of miles away. You're building things out of local materials and so forth. Equity is an important piece of that as well. That's the 4th item. Equitable access to social and economic resources, making sure that polluters pay for their pollution. And then lastly, responsible regionalism, and that's making sure you're minimizing harm to other communities. It is related to smart growth and new urbanism, and that's where it gets a little bit fuzzy. So after talking about conventional low-density development and sustainable development, the authors then go on to talk about smart growth development. Smart growth development is kind of a more regional concept. It's not really developed in terms of like a physical plan. It's based on the notion that the process, on 6 notions, that number 1, that the process should be inclusive of everybody and that it should be built on common ground. It's physically, it's thought of as being compact development that's mixed use and design. It's from a transportation perspective, it gives people a choice of travel. So they're not just traveling by car, but they're also using active transportation, meaning they walk or bicycle or have public transit available. 4th, that it's revitalizing existing communities. So you'll read policies about adaptive reuse. 5th, it talks about that it's the opposite of sprawl, that again, that it's compact development in downtowns. And then lastly, it includes directing development away from ecologically sensitive areas. And all of those things are smart. So the last type of community that the authors go over is a new urbanist community. And this is the most recent strategy that is in of the 4. The new urbanist community was developed by architects and planners who had a big interest in the built environment. And so it does have a strong architectural bent. It specifies an actual physical layout for a community, and that focuses more on land use and street patterns. It's led by the Congress for New Urbanism, and you can become a certified planner through the Congress for New Urbanism. It focuses on restoring existing urban areas, but you'll also find whole built new urbanist communities. It does not include kind of a sprawling style of development. Often it has a kind of more dense cores with a lower density areas on the outside. But it does have kind of a real distinct neighborhood feel and a diverse district feel. There usually includes conservation elements, historic preservation elements. There's actually 27 principles to urbanism. And that includes things such as having a pedestrian focus, having a grid layout, not having cul-de-sacs, focusing communities on shared space, and kind of that half-mile village scale. So to kind of talk about the relationship between each of these styles of communities, your smart growth tends to focus more on the macro scale, so kind of that larger scale, while your new urbanism focuses more on a smaller part of a community. Smaller, it's usually like a new development coming forward or a small portion of a city, and it tends to be much more focused on the physical layout. New urbanism does provide limited direction on environmentalism and social equity. It's growing in that nature because they have recognized the importance of it. So now that we've gone over the land use planning arena and we've talked about the different types of communities that are out there, let's go over some of the different land use values people will bring to the process. The authors call out 4 different values: economic development, environmental protection, equity, and livability. In terms of economic development values, what we see here is that we'll have people who join the game of land use planning who see land as a commodity. They will see land as a tool to create profit, and they'll see that winning the game is equal to increasing their profits. Now, I don't want to paint a picture of this as a huge negative. There will be a lot of people who come to your land use planning process who are good people who just come with a perspective from this economic development perspective. You'll have members of the Chamber of Commerce. You'll have larger businesses who want to make sure that they can continue to operate and provide jobs for your community. You'll have small business owners who want to make sure that the plan reflects their values and doesn't replace them with, larger, bigger businesses. You'll have people who want to make sure that there's jobs for them in the future and that there's good paying jobs for them, that it's not just all industrial jobs or office jobs or small scale retail jobs, that there's a wide variety of jobs to choose from. So you're going to have a lot of different interests that come. The authors outline 3 different types of entrepreneurs who may be involved in your process. The first, they use the word serendipitous, which really just means accidental. That means these are accidental entrepreneurs. They are inadvertently gaining wealth through the process. And what they mean by that is that you'll have people who own land, maybe it's an apartment building or maybe it's a commercial building, and they just inherited it. And if you change the land use on their property and you've increased their floor area ratio, or you allow them to expand their property, have more density, that creates increased potential wealth for them, and it's kind of an accident in the process. They're accidentally winning out in the process. Then they have what are called active entrepreneurs. And these are people who are looking at forecasting. They are trying to make wise investments in the process. These are probably your local property owners who own a shopping center, or maybe a realtor who owns a couple of pieces of land. And then your third area are structural speculators. This is your third type of entrepreneurs, structural speculators. And these are organized coalitions of people. These are the most important of the types of people. These are when bankers and lawyers and real estate agents and developers all get together. And you might have them join your process through what's called the Building Industry Association, or the BIA. Sometimes people call the Urban Land Institute one of these kind of structural entrepreneurs, organized coalition of people who are interested in economic development. There are some challenges in that we need to take into account in the land use plan, how our land use plans affect market demand. And any good land use plan should have a component where an economist is looking at the proposed land uses and the densities of those uses to figure out what the impact of that plan would be on the economy of that area. The land use plan will state where development can occur, how much development occur. Sometimes it will state when that can occur, what infrastructure is needed to occur, and it's set standards. So that's how the land use plan affects economic development. So the second land use value that the authors highlight is the environmental protection value. And someone who approaches the land use game with this value sees the city as a consumer of resources, a consumer of land, and potentially even a producer of waste. And so they want to protect the environment, and they could be protecting it for utilitarian purposes or because nature itself has some intrinsic value. And so the authors highlight three different types of environmental protectionist. The first is someone who protects it because they see some direct utility or direct use of that value. They would, for instance, look at a piece of the environment and say, well, what good is it? Does this do me some good? And if so, then let's protect it. They don't tend to value economically useless sections of an ecosystem. So they might look at a forest and they could see some economic benefit there. They could say that there is a benefit to tourism, or they could say that they could remove some of the trees and produce paper or build houses. They could look at a quarry and use a large amount of the minerals that are there for making concrete and building houses or streets and roads. And so they see value in that. And that's interestingly, it seems to be that's how the conservation element of a general plan came out, where there was a need to conserve the environment because that environment also provided some direct utility. So the first type of person is direct utility values. Then there's some indirect utility values, and that's the idea that ecosystems serve to offer humans some benefits. And so you might think of somebody who supports tree preservation because it helps reduce the urban heat island effect. Lastly, or the third type, is the intrinsic value, that there is a deep intrinsic value to all aspects of the environment and ecosystems. And people who approach environmental protection with that deep intrinsic value just has a deep appreciation for all different forms of life. So the third type of values that someone's going to bring to the land use process are equity values. And people who come with that set of values see the city as a place of conflict about distribution of resources, services, and opportunities. Now, land use patterns, they would say, should improve conditions of low income and minorities. And it's important for them that equitable access to social and economic resources occurs. They would be opposed to things like the unfair siting of a freeway, where hazardous materials would be placed near people of low income or minority populations, or that heavy industry is focused in those communities. When working on the general plan in Pasadena, one of the issues that came up in the northwest part of the city, which is the lowest income area of the city, was that although it was beneficial to put affordable housing there because the land was cheaper and you could build more affordable housing units, the people there felt, well, we've already had so much affordable housing here, it's time to distribute it across the city. And so there was kind of that tension about equity issues in the Northwest and continuing to put more and more affordable housing in their neighborhoods. People who bring equity values believe that their benefits and burdens should be shared equally. And recently, feminists have been adding gender to both the class and race issues that have been revolving around equity values. And lastly, the fourth type of value that someone's going to bring to a land use process are livability values. And that's just the idea that people want to preserve and enhance the social and physical amenities that improve life. They want to see communities that are safe. They want to have a great lifestyle. They want to live in a beautiful community. Who doesn't want that? So you might hear people talk about historic preservation. In Pasadena, we had a group called Pasadena Beautiful, and they just worked towards making a more beautiful city. They supported things like tree preservation, the Civic Center, and creating better design there. You might have a group called Tree People, or something similar, where people really focus on tree preservation, not so much from an environmental standpoint, but from a livability standpoint. Often your neighborhood watch people come to land use planning issues with livability in mind. The authors note that sometimes that this can lead to NIMBYism. Again, NIMBY means not in my backyard. Sometimes you'll hear the term LULUs, locally unwanted land uses. People don't want LULUs in their backyard. And then sometimes people even use the phrase a banana, which is build absolutely nothing, absolutely anywhere near anyone. The public participation process can lead to self-interested, short-sighted, segregation, and fear. But don't paint everybody into that same corner or that same impression. It should be our goal as planners to create communities that are economically vital, that do protect the environment, that do create equity, but that are also livable. They're places that people want to live. They're safe, they're beautiful, and they offer a wonderful lifestyle. So as part of that, we need to create that broad participation. We need to include perhaps some education component within our general plan or land use process. We also need to think about regionalism and how we connect with the cities around us, especially in order to counteract some of those NIMBY type ideas. So underlying the economic development, environmental protection, equity, and livability values is the idea of forming coalitions. And the notion here is that in order to get one plan through the city council with all of these different values and all these different community groups and all these different coalitions, is that you need to create some coalitions. And you might find that these naturally develop over time, or you may need to help create coalitions that bind even more coalitions together. And sometimes land use decisions or even land use plans can create some strange bedfellows. Sometimes we'll see NIMBYs connect with very eco-oriented people. Eco-oriented people tend not to want to see a lot more development because they feel like that's going to create some negative environmental impacts. And so you'll see them connect with NIMBYs. Sometimes you'll see YIMBYs, yes, in my backyard people who want to see growth occur, connect with entrepreneurs and business interests and then economic development people to see development occur. We see a lot on California Environmental Quality Act cases that have an environmental impact report or even a mitigated negative declaration. We see unions connecting with environmental groups to try and get councils to not approve projects unless the property owner agrees to pay union wages or support a union or make certain concessions in terms of the environment. And so we're usually, unions and environmental groups don't typically come together. Sometimes they do and create a coalition. And then often you'll see some coalitions revolving around social advocacy. And so you'll have some coalitions between low-income groups and minorities, all trying to seek some equity. And so it's your job as a planner to try and help build trust and relationship between and cooperation between each of these different types of groups. So now we're almost done. We've got one last section to do under chapter 1. I'm sure you're relieved. We've talked about the land use planning arena. We've talked about the different types of communities. We've talked about the different values people bring to the land use process. And now we'll end with the land use planning program. So when you're in a good planning department, you'll have a set of planning support systems that will help you when you go to do a general plan update or a specific plan update. And what I mean by planning support systems is you will have a series of reports that you've been updating annually so that you have information about the community. Often these are quantitative, sometimes they're qualitative as well. Regularly, cities do a check-in with their planning commission on how their general plan is being implemented. They'll do a general plan implementation report that is then sent to the state as well. So as part of that, often cities will present, some updates about how much development has occurred, how much development might be left in the general plan, and what's happening in terms of the different programs and policies that the general plan called for. In addition to that, each city in the state of California has to do a report to the Housing and Community Development Department every year on how much housing has been built and what housing programs have been instituted, how much affordable housing development has been brought in, and so forth. In Pasadena, we had what was called a metrics report that we started to develop during the general plan process, but then we kept up with it for a few years. And we tracked, where development was occurring, how much development was occurring, what demographics were changing, so that we could always have a good sense of what was happening in the community. And so these are good things to have as part of a planning support system. Now, when you go to actually start the planning process, you will note that there are numbers of different types of plans out there. In California, we tend to use two of these, and that's the general plan and the specific plan. But other communities you'll find use community plans like they're doing now in Los Angeles. And then throughout the nation, you'll see different types of plans as well. In California, we call the comprehensive plan a general plan. And this is generally a long-range planning document. It typically has a time horizon of 20 to 30 years, although it should be updated approximately every 10 years. And the goal of the general plan is to guide where additional growth should occur, what types of uses should be in the city, what they should be designed like. Sometimes they include some design or livability standards, and sometimes even the rate of development. The general plan should be a consensus-based document, and it usually starts with creating a vision for a community, and then after that vision has been created, then a series of goals, objectives, and or policies are developed, and then that's all sitting on an implementation plan. It's an important document to help create a balance between long and short range issues, and it's generally there to set pictures. It's generally a policy document with with a land use diagram. A land use diagram is like a zoning map, but has less specificity. So the authors also introduce what's called an area-wide plan, which demonstrates where areas are transitioning from rural to urban development, and it shows where future growth can be accommodated. Then there's community-wide plans. That's a more specific arrangement of where land use patterns should occur and where uses and densities should occur. And then there's specific plans. We call them specific plans in California. This provides highly detailed information on, usually it includes a vision statement as well. It usually has a land use map in it that is like a zoning map, so it'll have more specificity than the general plan map. It may have, generally will have design standards. It often will have infrastructure standards, so you can see what the street face is going to look like, what furniture is going to be out there. Cities might adopt a specific plan either for a whole new residential development that's occurring, or it could be a specific plan for a central business district or for a different business district. It could be a specific plan for an urban space network, open space network, something like that. So your next kind of step in that network of plans is that your plans then rely on ordinances. Ordinances are really just legal documents, laws that are passed by a city or county board of supervisors. And beyond your ordinances, there's also maybe some infrastructure improvement plans. You might have a sewer master plan. Things like that. And then you have the project review process, and that's just the day-to-day planning process where you take in plans, you review it against the ordinances and the general plan goals, and make sure that they comply. So if you've taken a policy class, a public policy class, this next point will not escape you, but it escapes many good planners, and that's the importance of monitoring and evaluation. Once we create a policy, we need to monitor to see if the way we're enacting that policy is meeting the stated outcome or desire that is in the policy document. So it's important for us to monitor the general plan or specific plan to see if it's having the environmental impact that we thought it was going to have, whether it was having the economic development that we thought it was going to have, and the social outcomes. In the general plan process in Pasadena, we were looking at the South Fair Oaks specific plan, for example. And as part of the general plan process, we had noted that the South Fair Oaks specific plan had been in place for 20 years, and the goal of the specific plan was to create a biotech corridor. And none of that came to fruition after 20 years. And so we kind of threw up our hands and said, okay, this isn't working. Let's look at fostering mixed-use development in that section instead. And then as we were going through the general plan process, we had a number of applicants come in asking to build medical office building, which is exactly what the plan had called for. And so we had to kind of shuffle and change some policies and goals for that specific plan area. So you need to continue to monitor that. It's important that you see what's feeding these planning support systems. You're catching the data, you're reviewing these data documents like the annual progress report. And you need to go back and review your specific plans and general plans regularly every 5 to 10 years to make sure that they're having the desired outcome. So you'll be happy to know that we're on slide 21 of 22. And we're almost done, but I think this is maybe the most interesting slide for some of the students who are just starting to understand what it means to be a planner. And your role as a planner is kind of 5 pieces in the planning process. And that's number 1, you're going to write the rules of the game. You're going to say how often people can be involved in the land use process, how they can be involved. Do you have to be on a committee to be involved in the process? How often are you going to go out to the general public? What are those meetings going to look like? What type of activities are there going to be at the meetings? Are they all going to be educational, or are they going to provide for a lot of community input? As the planner on the land use program, you get to decide the rules of the games for the most part. And as the planner, it's your role to advocate for greater public interest. The notion being that the more the public is involved, the better the decisions that will come to, and the better that those decisions reflect the entire community and not just a few people's public interest. It's important for you to constrain your own desires by both the professional methods that are out there with the AICP Code of Ethics and just good tenets and ethics. It's your job as the planner to make a formal recommendation to the City Council. Nobody else gets to do that. The public doesn't make a formal recommendation. They don't write a staff report and submit it. They get to complain about your formal recommendation, but you have a lot of power in that you get to offer a formal recommendation to the City Council. Sometimes it's going to be modified, but you generally get to make that formal recommendation. And then it's also your role to be subject to criticism and scrutiny. It's probably the part of the job that most planners hate, but it's important for us to be able to be willing to hear critical feedback and make adjustments. In a document the size of a general plan, you will make errors. There will be mapping errors, there will be problems, there will be things you didn't think about. And so it's important to keep your mind open, to not have such a high opinion of yourself and so much pride that you're not willing to hear and listen to people and sit down and talk to them about their concerns. So be willing to take that criticism and scrutiny. And then lastly, to be a successful planner, there are 6 items that this author says you need to have. I don't think this is comprehensive, but it's perhaps a good starting point. 1, you need to be visionary. To be a planner, you have to be able to think about the future, both physically, but also future generations. You have to be thinking about how they will be impacted. You need to be able to look forward and see what are the emerging needs of a community. And if you can create powerful images to capture that vision, all the better. You need to be able to think comprehensively. You need to be able to see one or two things, three or four or five things, and see how they all link together, and then help the public see that, so that someone's not coming to the land use planning game and only thinking about one piece of the puzzle. To get people to think about multiple pieces is part of what a good planner does. Often planners, we feel a lot like a jack of all trade and a master of none, and that we know a little bit about everything and how they fit together. We need to be technically competent. We need to be able to be effective politically. We need to be able to know how to forecast. We need to know how to detect a trend. We need to be able to know how to research. We need these technical competencies. At the same time, we need to be fair, and we need to understand that every portion of our community needs to have an equal opportunity to be at the table and to give input. And then we need to have ability to look for consensus, that in everything we're trying to build an open process that's inclusive of everybody, where we're not just providing more participation, but that we're providing consensus throughout that participation. And lastly, we need to be innovative. We need to be constantly thinking about new approaches. With every age and every time, there's different values, there's different needs, and we need to be looking for new ways of approaching them. So with that, that's chapter 1 of framing the land use planning process. I gave you a quick introduction. We talked about the land use planning arena, how it's messy, and how we need a framework that's flexible, it's not so stringent, that it's not designed by like an engineer where there's strong rules, but it's a flexible framework. That planning, from the author's perspective, is like a game. There's a lot of different players, and in the end, the planners are making the rules. And then we ended talking about how we as planners have to be very careful when we're making the rules. We talked about the different values, planning and sustainable communities. We talked about conventional low density development. We talked about sustainable development, smart growth, and new urbanism. And then we talked about different types of land use values, how people are going to come to this land use game with 4 different types of values. That some people are going to come with a strong economic development value. Some are going to come with a sense of the need to protect the environment. Others with a strong social equity component. And lastly, some are going to be looking at the need for livability. And then we talked about land use planning program. We talked about those planning support systems that are out there and the need to monitor. We talked about the different network of plans, from the general plan down to the specific plans, then down to ordinances and infrastructure plans. And then lastly, we talked about those core planning capabilities, which you need to be a good planner.